So we are still talking during the Easter season about the poetry of John. The poetry, as you've heard today, from John the Revelator, from John the Apostle, and we include each week a poem from St. John of the Cross. This week's poem is very brief. St. John of the Cross writes, and this is entitled, If You Love. You might quiet the whole world for a second if you pray. I think I should say that again. You might quiet the whole world for a second if you pray. And if you love, if you really love, our guns will wilt. I told you it was short. The poetry of St. John of the Cross, the poetry of John the Revelator. You know, anytime you see apocalyptic literature in the Bible, it's like, if you read Isaiah and you think like, you know, the Beatles, you really start to get it. You know, it's poetry, it's imagery, it's beautiful stuff. If you read Daniel that way, if you read the great apocalyptic writings, and Revelation is certainly that way. But I keep telling you, I see the repetition of language and the rhythm in the Gospel of John. And so today in the reading, we saw this word glorify. It is the Greek word doxazo, D-O-X-A-Z-O in the English. Doxazo, glorify, or glorified. It changes forms in there. Put that reading up again. Can we do that, Cheryl? And just, I don't know how it would have sounded if this were a litany in the early church. But I think probably those repeating words are a clue. So when you see that, say it with me. When he had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man has been glorified. And God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself. And will glorify him at once. That's a lot of glorified in one paragraph. Little children, I'm with you only a little longer. How about that? Isn't that something? And then comes what we know now as the great commandment from Jesus. The commandment that we love one another. I wonder what is wrapped up in those two words. Glorify and love. They're key words in understanding this litany, this possible litany in the early church. You know, in the early church, many of what I like to say is that the Johannine, can you capture that word in your mind? Johannine. That means the group of people who are following the teachings of St. John, the Apostle. So this piece of work called the Gospel of John is not only being written by an apostle or perhaps spoken orally, but it's being collected and it's being edited by this Johannine community. And there were so many communities in the early church that people tend to think that today in our pluralistic world, you know, like we are the pluralistic world, and 2,000 years ago they were of one, maybe two minds, you know. And so we tend to think that denominations are the result of so many years of growth and dysfunction in the life of the church, when the fact is there were as many or more factions and divisions in the church in the first century than there are denominations to speak of today. And denominations, on the one hand, serve a great purpose in the body of Christ and in the church of Jesus Christ, because there are a great number of people around the world, and guess what? They don't all think like me. They don't all think like you. They don't all respond to the same things that you and I do. So in the one hand, many denominations serve the church in so many ways to bring a more diverse group of people into the church of Jesus Christ. And then in another way, denominations can be very toxic if they become divisions. And particularly when one denomination criticizes or even lashes out against another. That can be very harmful. And the primary reason that is harmful is because the world is paying attention. The world is watching to see what we will do. And I think it's wrapped up in this litany, in this reading from today. Do you know what else serves a great purpose besides poetry and litany and liturgy in the early church? Is storytelling. You know, the Gospel of John, I think, is full of pieces of litany, but they are connected like sinew by these stories. These wonderful stories with great images and pictures. Story has this wonderful quality that it can draw you and I into the story until we find ourselves in that story somewhere. Most of the stories Jesus tells are meant to displace us in some way or another, by pulling us in and say, look into this story and see where perhaps you may be missing the mark. There's a story that's happening in this reading today, and you cannot understand the glory of Jesus and the glory of God that John's gospel is outlining if you do not understand the story that sets up this reading. You see, this is the end of John's telling of the last gathering of Jesus and the disciples. It's what we celebrate at this table week after week when we come together and say, on the night that he was betrayed, Jesus took bread and he took the cup and he shared it with even Judas and with the other friends around the table. And the three synoptic gospels tell pretty much the same story, but John's gospel is a little different. In John's gospel, on that evening, Jesus begins by doing something completely unreasonable. Jesus takes a towel and he drapes it around himself, a slave's clothing, a servant's outfit. And he takes a basin and he begins to wash the feet of his disciples until they become uncomfortable. And finally, with Peter, who always had a way of being the most vocal and the most uncomfortable of all, and he says, no, this is not right. Peter is telling the truth. This is not right. It shouldn't be this way. And there is Jesus. There is Jesus, dressed in a slave's outfit, washing the feet of his disciples. And as the evening goes on, before they go out, he ends the evening by talking about his glory. You get it? The glory of God is to be wrapped in a servant's costume. The glory of heaven is Jesus in flesh, is God like you and like me. And the glory of Christ is God serving. The one who should be served is the one bowing before us and serving. And Peter nailed it. It's not right. The glory of God is to be the servant of the other. And then he says, with this example of God's glory in the world, I give you a new commandment, not a suggestion, not a hint, not a clue, not a follow this to the next location and there you'll find your next clue, not a treasure hunt. This is the jackpot. This is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Look no further. This is a commandment that you love one another. Because he said, you've seen me love you today, tonight, in this act. Now love one another because I have loved you. And also because the world is watching to see what we will do. Agape. Now, Jesus is not saying fall in love with each other. Agape. Now, Jesus is not saying, well, get in there and do the best you can. Jesus is not saying phileo. Love these people because they're part of your church and they're like you. The word, again, is agape. It is charity. I wanted to know more about love. So early in my life of discipleship, I looked to the scripture. What does it say about love? And the best place was present every time I went to a wedding, every time you wanted to find something about love. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. There I found out the qualities of love are agape, or charity, or patience and kindness. That love is not overprotective. And it's not boastful, it's not arrogant, or it's not rude, it's not irritable or resentful. Love keeps no records of right and wrong. Now you understand why it's okay to say Peter got this right. It's not right. Jesus can't be doing this. But love keeps no record. Love doesn't care what is right or what is wrong. Love doesn't care who is right or who is wrong. Love is about relationship, not about being right. Try this. Be wrong on purpose sometime, but don't let them catch you doing it. And I didn't say do something wrong. I mean, like, don't win the argument. Just give up. Just say, oh, yeah, you're right. Love never fails. I heard it said this way once, love never quits. And I like that because I'm not a quitter. I hate quitting. Love never quits. I heard a great sermon one time that got stuck in my head, and it ended with this, and it was on 1 Corinthians 13, and it ended with love expects the best. And I don't know how I got there, but I put of others in my mind. Maybe he said it, maybe she said it, I don't remember. And I lived with that for a number of years, and it became one of those things that I thought was in the Bible, and the more I looked, it wasn't. You know, like sayings like God helps those who help themselves, and that's not in the Bible. Fact is, now we pretty much understand most of the time God helps us when we are at a point that we can't help ourselves, or that charity begins at home, and then I found out that that's not really said in the Bible, and love expects the best. But that's not what Paul said. He said love is not boastful or resentful. It keeps no record of right or wrong. It is not arrogant. It is not rude. It never quits. So there's this thing in the world. There are a number of people who are legitimately disabled, and I have friends like this who are living on about $1,050 a month. And when they make any more money than that, they are told by the Social Security Department that if you can earn money, then we need to cut off some of your money and some of your benefits because you're not disabled if you can earn money. And so people who are legitimately disabled are held at the poverty level on purpose. And there's a good reason for doing it. Because over here, there's this group of people who are riding the system and who are taking advantage of it. They're called welfare abusers. We've been complaining about them ever since the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And we like to quote 2 Thessalonians, if you don't work, you don't eat. And so this group of people basically is really holding this other group of people who are legitimately disabled down because they cannot rise above the poverty level because we are afraid that if we give too much, then the abusers will take from the system. And that is correct, and that is right. That is right. And then there is this perception that if I give money to someone in the name of Christ, and how many times have you heard this or perhaps said it yourself? I don't want to give to somebody if I'm afraid they're going to spend the money on the wrong thing. So I'm a little careful to give to the wino on the corner because that person may spend that money on alcohol. I know the sign says food. I know the sign says veteran. I know the sign says homeless. By the way, I'm going to be a bit sexist, but I saw a remarkably attractive young woman on the corner 2 days ago with a sign that said, I have a child, I lost my job, I'm homeless, please help. How's that happen? Now, I'm not trying to say anything about attractive people and unattractive people. I'm just saying. I was afraid for her safety. But how's that happen? I mean, I understand, like you, but not the pretty people. So I won't give money to that person because they might spend it on alcohol, or they might be lying, and they might be telling the truth. Now, Jesus says to love without boundaries, to love without expectations. Paul says that love has no expectations. And the world says that we cannot effectively help someone because of the people who are ripping off the system. Now, in the early Johannine community, I believe that perhaps one reason they included this piece of litany or this passage in their library was perhaps to remind themselves that love begins at home. Or, if I might say this, charity does indeed begin at home. I'm not talking about the kind of charity where we would withhold resources from someone who needs those resources in order that we may spend them on ourselves or those that we love. That's not the kind of charity I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of charity that is patient, that is kind, that keeps no records of right or wrong, that is never arrogant or rude or boastful. The kind of charity that has no expectation. Perhaps the Johannine community included this because they needed to be reminded that charity begins at home because the world is paying attention. They're watching. One of the reasons that some people of other faiths or no faith at all are critical of Christianity is because many Christians do not follow the commandments and the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus perhaps is saying to this community of believers in the first century, and perhaps to this community of believers today, that the world is watching. And that what I have given you has the power to change the world. But before you run out and change the world with it, perhaps it's a good thing to start inside. The world is watching. I wonder sometimes if we are changing the world or if the world is still creeping in and affecting the church. Are we giving? Are we being charitable? And I don't mean, again, here's $1. Please get yourself out of trouble. Jesus said this, and I'll repeat it. You can't buy this. Are we being lavish and charitable in our love toward one another? Have we been able to turn loose of expectations, or have we been able to move beyond saying, well, it's just not right, because it's just not right? But that's not got anything to do with being related. That has to do with winning the argument. And love does not seek to win the argument. Are we changing the world because of who we are and how Jesus is affecting us inside? Or are we letting the values of the world around us creep in to our lives of discipleship? We have something very powerful here. Far too powerful to be trusted to us. And yet God has given it to us freely with no expectation. We could change the world. You know what I believe? I believe there are 10,000 people in Abilene, Texas that want to come to this church. Because I don't think there's another congregation in Abilene quite like this one. And while I understand that all of them are unique, some of them are more unique than others, and some of them honestly aren't very unique at all. But they tell me that in terms of serious spirituality and inclusive faith, that about 1% of the people, and if you do the math in Abilene, that's 10,000 people. They just don't know we're here. And someone said to me today, we should go tell them. And I said, wait a minute. We've been talking for a long time. It's love. It's charity. It's radical inclusion. It's that will change the world. But we must be on guard, because the world will not lie down. No record of right or wrong. No arrogance. May God help us. Will you pray with me?